The Miami sun was a physical weight, pressing down on the asphalt and baking the fiberglass of the half-restored hulls scattered across the boatyard. Zara wiped a streak of grease from her forehead with the back of her wrist, leaving a dark smudge against her deep brown skin. The air inside the dry dock smelled of resin, salt, and the creeping metallic tang of desperation. She tightened her grip on the wrench, her muscles burning as she fought a rusted bolt on the intake valve of a 1980s sport fisher. Just one more job, she told herself, the mantra playing on a loop in her exhausted mind. Just one more job, and I can make this month's interest payment. But Zara knew the math wasn't working. She had been working double shifts for 6 months, ever since her father's sudden heart attack left her with the keys to King's Marine Restoration and a mountain of tangled finances. Much like a struggling jazz singer fighting a microphone stand for meager tips, Zara was fighting against a tide that was rapidly pulling her under. "Zara!" The shout broke her concentration. She slid out from beneath the hull on her mechanic's creeper, squinting against the harsh glare of the afternoon sun. Matteo, her lead mechanic and oldest friend, was standing at the edge of the dry dock. The color had completely drained from his face. "What is it?" she asked, grabbing a rag and tossing the wrench into her toolbox. "You need to come to the front office," Matteo said, his voice unusually tight. "Now, there are some guys here." A cold spike of adrenaline pierced through the suffocating heat. Zara didn't ask questions. She dropped the rag and broke into a jog, her steel-toed boots crunching over the gravel. When she pushed open the frosted glass door of the main office, the blast of the AC did nothing to chill her as much as the sight before her. 3 men were standing in her father's cramped, wood-paneled office. They didn't belong in a boatyard. They were wearing immaculate, lightweight summer suits that spoke of offshore accounts and cold, hard calculations. They looked like predators examining a very small, very trapped fish. "Can I help you?" Zara asked, stepping in front of her father's old mahogany desk, instinctively blocking them from it. The man in the center, a tall, broad-shouldered enforcer with a face like a slab of concrete, smiled. It was a dry, humorless expression. "Zara King, we've been looking for you." "You found me," she said, crossing her grease-stained arms. "Now who are you, and why are you in my office?" "We represent the Vargas syndicate," the man said smoothly, pulling a leather-bound folder from his jacket. "We are here to discuss your father's outstanding accounts." "My father is dead," Zara snapped, the grief still a raw, jagged thing in her chest. "And his business accounts are being handled by probate. If he owed you for parts, you'll have to get in line with the suppliers." The man chuckled, a sound that made the hairs on the back of Zara's neck stand up. "Darling, your father didn't buy boat parts from us. He bought time. He borrowed heavily against this yard, against the inventory, against things he didn't even have the right to leverage. The principal was substantial. The compounded interest over the last 2 years? It's astronomical." He opened the folder and slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. Zara looked down. The numbers blurred, then sharpened into a reality so horrifying her lungs forgot how to pull in air. $3 million. $3 million, she whispered, her voice cracking. "That's impossible. This yard isn't even worth a fraction of that." "We are aware," the man said, his tone turning to ice. "Which is why we are calling the debt in. You have exactly 30 days to clear the balance. If you fail, we take the boatyard, we take the land, we take your father's house, and we take whatever you have left." The room began to spin. 3 million. She couldn't make that in 3 lifetimes, let alone 30 days. "I don't have it," she choked out. "Please, there has to be a mistake." "The syndicate does not make mistakes, Miss King," the man said, stepping closer. The implicit violence in his posture was suffocating. 30 days. Actually, a new voice cut through the tension, deep, smooth, and laced with absolute authority. "She doesn't owe you a dime." Zara whipped around. The front door of the office had opened, and the blinding Miami sunlight spilled in, silhouetting a figure. As he stepped into the room, the oppressive atmosphere shifted entirely, sucked into the gravity of his presence. It was him, Julian Vance. He looked exactly as he had a month ago, yet entirely different. He was dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that fit his lean, powerful frame to perfection. His dark blonde hair was swept back, and his piercing blue eyes locked onto Zara with an intensity that felt like a physical strike. A month ago, she had known him only as Jules, a dangerously handsome stranger she had met at a neon-drenched rum bar on South Beach. She had been drowning her sorrows over a past-due electric bill. He had been sitting alone, radiating a quiet, lethal power. One drink turned into a conversation, which turned into the most intensely passionate, reckless night of her life. She had slipped out of his hotel room before dawn, assuming she would never see him again. She was wrong. The syndicate men stiffened. The concrete-faced leader took a half-step back, recognizing the man immediately. "Mr. Vance, we weren't expecting you." "Clearly," Julian said, his voice a low, terrifying purr. He didn't look at the men. His eyes were fixed solely on Zara, tracing the grease on her cheek, the erratic rise and fall of her chest, the raw panic in her eyes. He looked at her like she was a puzzle he had already solved. "What are you doing here?" Zara managed to whisper, her brain short-circuiting. The billionaire shipping magnate, the man who had held her in the dark just weeks ago, standing in her rundown boatyard. Julian finally broke his gaze from her and looked at the syndicate enforcer. He reached into his breast pocket, pulled out a thick, embossed document, and tossed it onto the desk, right over the $3 million demand. "I purchased the Vargas portfolio this morning," Julian stated casually, as if he were discussing a minor stock fluctuation. "All of it, including the debt of Elias King. You men work for me now, and your first order of business is to get out of my boatyard." The men didn't hesitate. They nodded sharply to Julian, spared Zara one last lingering glance, and filed out of the office. The heavy glass door clicked shut behind them, leaving the room in a deafening silence. Zara stared at the document on the desk. The logo of Vance Global Shipping was stamped in dark foil at the top. "You," she started, her mind struggling to catch up to the tectonic plates shifting beneath her life. "You bought my dad's debt." "I did," Julian said, taking a slow, deliberate step toward her. The air in the room felt suddenly thin, as if he were pulling all the oxygen into his own lungs. $3 million, plus the yard, the equipment, and the house. "Why?" Zara demanded, her shock rapidly morphing into a defensive, blazing fury. She stood up taller, refusing to cower. "Why would a billionaire buy the debt of a dead mechanic? Was it because of what happened between us? Are you holding a grudge because I left before you woke up?" Julian stopped a foot away from her. He was so close she could smell his cologne, sea salt, expensive leather, and cold, hard power. "I don't hold grudges, Zara. I acquire assets," he said smoothly. "When I woke up to an empty bed, I was intrigued. So I looked into you, and I found that the brilliant, fiery woman I spent the night with was drowning in a mess she didn't create. I decided to solve the problem. By buying me," she yelled, slamming her hands down on the desk. "You can't just buy a person's life." Julian didn't flinch. The anger radiating off her seemed to only fascinate him more. He reached out, his long fingers gently tucking a stray, grease-stained curl behind her ear. His touch sent a violent shiver down her spine. "In my world, Zara, I can buy whatever I want," he whispered, his voice dark and absolute. "Which means, as of this morning, I own this yard. I own the boats. And by extension, I own your time. I am not a piece of property," she hissed, stepping back from his touch, though every nerve in her body was screaming at the proximity. "No, you're a very stubborn woman in an impossible situation," Julian corrected, dropping his hand. He stepped back, the mask of the ruthless CEO falling perfectly into place. "But I am a reasonable man. I'm offering you a deal." "I don't make deals with monsters," she spat. "You will make this one," Julian replied softly. "Because if you don't, I will execute the terms of the syndicate's loan. I will bulldoze this boatyard tomorrow. I will sell your family home, and I will leave you with absolutely nothing." Zara felt the blood drain from her face. The fight drained out of her, replaced by a cold, crushing reality. He wasn't bluffing. The man standing in front of her wasn't the passionate lover from the hotel room. He was a predator who had successfully cornered his prey. "What's the deal?" She forced the words out, tasting bile. Julian's eyes darkened, a predatory satisfaction gleaming in the icy blue. "You come with me to Monaco," he said. "You live in my compound. You do not work on boats. You will be exclusively available to me for the next 12 months. Available for social appearances, available for dinners." He paused, his gaze dropping briefly to her lips before returning to her eyes. "And available for whatever else I decide I need." "You want me to be your captive?" "I want you to be mine," he corrected softly. "Do this for 1 year, Zara, and I will wipe the $3 million debt clean. You can return to Miami, and this boatyard will be yours, free and clear." She looked around the cramped office. She saw the framed photos of her and her dad on his first restored skiff. She saw the faded blueprints on the walls. This place was her entire life, her entire legacy. To lose it meant losing the last piece of her father. Julian checked his watch, a custom timepiece worth more than the entire lot of boats outside. My jet leaves from the private terminal in 2 hours. Go home. Pack a bag. If you aren't on that plane, I make the call to the bulldozers. He turned and walked toward the door. Wait, Zara called out, her voice shaking. Julian paused, his hand on the glass door handle. He looked back over his shoulder. I'll do it, she whispered, the words tasting like poison. I'll go to Monaco. A slow, devastating smile spread across Julian's face. It was the smile of a man who had just won a war without firing a single shot. I know, he said softly. As the door closed behind him, leaving Zara alone in the silence of her ruined life, she realized with horrifying clarity that she hadn't just made a deal to save her father's legacy. She had just traded one drowning for another. And Julian Vance was the ocean that was about to swallow her whole. Monaco was a gilded cage, and the cliffside compound of Julian Vance was its highest, most impenetrable tower. For a week, Zara had paced the imported marble floors of the sprawling estate, a prisoner surrounded by staggering, suffocating wealth. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Mediterranean Sea sparkled like crushed diamonds, but inside, the air was thick with a dangerous, unresolved tension. Julian had kept his distance during the daylight hours, handling his global shipping empire from his study. But at night, she could feel his presence in the estate, a silent, predatory weight pressing against her bedroom door. Tonight, the tension finally snapped. Zara stormed into Julian's cavernous, dimly lit study. The room smelled of expensive leather, old paper, and his signature scent, a dizzying mix of cedar, rain, and cold, hard power. Julian was standing by the mahogany bar, pouring a glass of amber whiskey. He wore a crisp white shirt unbuttoned at the collar, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with lean muscle. I want my phone back, Zara demanded, her voice shaking with a potent mix of fear and fury. You can't cut me off from the rest of the world. Matteo is trying to run the yard, and I need to tell him what to do. Julian didn't look up immediately. He took a slow sip of his whiskey, the ice clinking softly against the crystal. Then he turned to her. His eyes were so blue they were almost black in the low light, filled with a dark, consuming hunger that made her breath hitch. Matteo has been generously compensated to manage the yard, Julian said, his voice a smooth, terrifyingly calm purr. Your only job now, Zara, is to be here. With me. He set the glass down and began to close the distance between them. He moved with a lethal grace, not hurrying, just stalking forward like a predator who knew its prey had absolutely nowhere to run. Zara backed up until her hips hit the edge of his massive desk. You don't own me, Julian, she whispered, her chest heaving as she tried to project a defiance she didn't fully feel. Don't I? He murmured, stopping mere inches from her. The heat radiating off his body was intoxicating. Julian reached out, his large hands gripping her waist. His touch was heavy and intensely possessive. He pulled her flush against him, eradicating the space between them. Zara gasped, her hands instinctively flying up to his chest to push him away, but the moment her palms met the hard, warm plane of his muscles, her betrayal was instant. Her body remembered the reckless, fiery night they had shared in Miami. You're fighting me, Zara, Julian whispered, leaning down until his lips brushed the sensitive skin just below her ear. But your heart is beating out of your chest. You want this just as much as you hate it. Before she could form a denial, his mouth crashed down on hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a demand, a possession, a claiming. He kissed like an absolute sinner, drawing a desperate moan from her throat. The intimacy was explosive and overwhelming. His hands slid up her back, tangling in her thick curls, pulling her deeper into the kiss while the world around them melted into a haze of sensory overload. For a terrifying, breathless moment, Zara surrendered, her hands gripping his shirt, kissing him back with all the pent-up frustration and passion boiling inside her. But then the reality of her chains slammed back into her mind. $3 million. The ultimatum. The captive. With a sudden surge of willpower, Zara violently shoved him back. She stumbled away from the desk, her lips swollen, her eyes blazing with humiliated tears. I am not for sale, she screamed, the words tearing out of her raw throat. Desperate to hurt him, to shatter his suffocating control, she grabbed the first thing her hand found on his desk, a heavy, intricately brass-bound 18th-century maritime compass, and hurled it across the room. It smashed against the stone fireplace, the glass shattering and the antique brass denting as it rained down onto the rug. Zara stood there, chest heaving, waiting for the explosion. She waited for the monster to finally bare his teeth. But Julian didn't flinch. He stood perfectly still, his eyes drifting slowly from the ruined antique back to her. The shift in his demeanor was chilling. An 18th-century naval compass used by the French Armada, Julian said, his voice dropping an octave into something dangerously cold. Market value, 250,000 euros. He walked slowly past her, the silence in the room deafening. He reached the heavy oak double doors of the study and, with a decisive, echoing click, he locked them. "Add that to your tab," he whispered, turning back to face her. "You are not leaving this room." The air thinned. The rage that had been simmering beneath Julian's polished exterior was finally bleeding through. He stalked toward her again, the terrifying intensity in his eyes making Zara's blood run cold. He wasn't going to kiss her this time. He grabbed her by the hips, his grip bruising as he backed her against the wall. "You think you can break my things?" he growled, his face inches from hers. "You think you can play games with me in my own house?" Panic, cold and sharp, seized Zara's heart. The billionaire wasn't playing anymore. She was entirely at his mercy, and she needed a weapon, any weapon, to stop him. The lie tasted like ash in her mouth, but she had no other choice. "I'm pregnant," she screamed, squeezing her eyes shut as she blurted out the words. "I'm pregnant with your heir." The effect was instantaneous. Julian went completely still. The terrifying, possessive anger that had been radiating off him vanished into thin air. He let out a ragged breath, stepping back as if she had physically struck him. He didn't yell. He didn't call her bluff. Instead, the ruthless CEO, the man who controlled global trade and terrified his enemies, dropped to his knees right there on the study floor. Ignoring the fact that he was ruining his tailored suit, he pressed his face against her stomach, his hands splayed wide over her hips, holding her as though she were suddenly made of the most fragile, priceless glass in the world. "A baby," Julian whispered, the words trembling against her skin. He looked up at her, and the coldness in his blue eyes had been entirely replaced by a burning, obsessive worship. She had just made the most dangerous mistake of her life. Zara looked down at the billionaire kneeling at her feet, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had just bought herself time, but as Julian looked at her like she was the most valuable thing on earth, she realized she had just made the most dangerous mistake of her life. The lie hung in the air of the locked study, heavy and absolute. Julian remained on his knees, his face pressed against Zara's stomach, his large, warm hands splayed possessively over her hips, holding her as though she were made of fragile glass. The ruthless shipping magnate who terrified the European underworld had been entirely undone by 3 words. He looked up at her, and the cold, calculating emptiness in his blue eyes was gone. In its place burned a dark, obsessive worship. "The debt is suspended," Julian vowed, his voice thick and trembling against her skin. "You do not owe me a dime, Zara. You are carrying my blood." He stood up, his massive frame towering over her, but there was no threat in his posture now. With a breathtaking, lethal grace, he scooped her into his arms, carrying her out of the ruined study and up the grand staircase to his master suite. That night, there was no distance between them. Julian held her against his chest, his body radiating a scorching, inescapable heat. He didn't sleep. He simply watched her in the dark, a fiercely protective guardian completely consumed by his new reality. But the fantasy of her safety shattered with the morning sun. Zara was awakened by the sensation of Julian's lips dragging slowly down the sensitive column of her neck. His hand rested heavily on her bare stomach, his thumb tracing slow, burning circles that made her breath hitch. The intimacy was intoxicating, dangerously blurring the lines between her captivity and her own undeniable desire. Before she could surrender to the feeling, the heavy double doors of the master's suite swung open without a knock. Julian went rigid, pulling the silk sheet over Zara with a protective snarl. Standing in the doorway was a woman carved from ice. She was impeccably dressed in a tailored, cream-colored haute couture suit, her neck draped in pearls that could likely pay off the entire Miami boatyard. She didn't look at the priceless art or the sweeping views of the Mediterranean. Her piercing, cold eyes locked directly onto Zara with absolute, dripping disdain. "Mother," Julian growled, stepping out of bed and pulling on a robe. "I didn't invite you. I invite myself when I hear my son has brought a desperate American mechanic into my family's home. Eleanor Vance replied, her British accent clipping the air like scissors. She looked Zara up and down, delivering the universal, silent glare of a woman observing a cockroach on her designer rug. You expect me to believe this girl is pregnant? She is a gold digger looking for a payout, Julian. And I am going to prove it. Eleanor snapped her fingers, perfectly manicured fingers. From the hallway, a nervous, sweating man in a designer suit stepped into the room. He was carrying a sleek, portable ultrasound machine. Zara's heart violently slammed against her ribs. The air in her lungs evaporated. This is it, she thought, panic icing her veins. I am going to prison. Dr. Laurent is the family's private concierge physician, Eleanor said, a shark-like smile spreading across her painted lips. If you are truly carrying the Vance heir, you will have no objection to a scan right now. Get him out of my bedroom, Julian ordered, his voice dropping into a terrifying register. She isn't feeling well. We will do this later. Julian, Zara whispered, her voice shaking. Julian looked at her, his expression torn. His desire to violently protect her was battling against his all-consuming obsession with his legacy. The vulnerability in his blue eyes was heartbreaking. He wasn't the monster in this moment, but a man desperately hungry for the family she had promised him. It will take 5 minutes, Zara, Julian said gently, taking her hand. Then I will throw them both off the cliff. I promise. I need to see it. Zara had no choice. She lay back against the pillows, squeezing her eyes shut as Dr. Laurent approached. The doctor lifted her shirt and squeezed a dollop of freezing gel onto her stomach. Eleanor crossed her arms, hovering like a vulture waiting for the kill. Julian gripped Zara's hand so tightly her bones ached. Dr. Laurent pressed the wand against her skin. The machine hummed. Zara braced herself for the explosion, waiting for Julian's worship to turn back into that terrifying, cold rage. But instead of a silent, empty womb, the monitor flickered. It showed absolutely nothing but gray, buzzing static. Eleanor let out a sharp, triumphant laugh. I knew it. Empty. Julian stopped breathing. He stared at the static, looking completely and utterly destroyed. Wait, Dr. Laurent stammered, wiping sweat from his brow and frantically tapping the side of the machine. The sensor. It's malfunctioning. What do you mean malfunctioning? Eleanor snapped, her aristocratic mask slipping. You incompetent fool. I dropped the case in the elevator, madam, the doctor lied, his voice trembling as he refused to meet anyone's eyes. The machine is broken. I cannot get a reading. We will need to go to the Monte Carlo clinic for a proper scan. For a fraction of a second, Dr. Laurent met Zara's terrified gaze. Why was he covering for her? Julian let out a breath that sounded like a predator's roar. He lunged forward, grabbing the ultrasound machine off its cart, and violently hurled it across the room. It smashed against the marble wall, the expensive plastic shattering into 100 pieces. Get out! Julian snarled at his mother, a vein pulsing in his neck. You bring incompetent staff into my home to stress my pregnant partner? You risk my child with broken equipment. Julian, she is lying. Eleanor shrieked. Get out, he roared, pointing at the door. Eleanor paled, clutching her pearls. We will go to the clinic tomorrow, Julian. And when she is exposed, do not come crying to me. She stormed out, the terrified doctor scrambling close behind her. The room fell into a deafening silence. Julian stood over the shattered machine, his chest heaving, his hands balled into fists. Zara sat up, frantically wiping the gel off her stomach, her entire body shaking. Julian turned to her. The anger vanished, instantly replaced by that dark, consuming hunger. He crossed the room in 2 strides, pulled her roughly off the mattress, and backed her against the wall, burying his face in her neck. I'm sorry, he groaned, his hands hot and heavy on her hips. I won't let her near you again. Tomorrow, we go to my private clinic. My rules. He pulled back, his large hands framing her face, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones. His eyes were wide, manic, and unhinged. You and this baby. You are the only things that matter to me now, he whispered, his lips brushing against hers. But hear me, Zara. If you lied to me, if there is no baby, I think I would burn this entire world to the ground. He kissed her, a bruising, passionate assault that tasted of a terrifying warning. Zara kissed him back, completely trapped in the heat of his embrace, knowing that she had only bought herself 24 hours. Tomorrow, there would be no broken machine to save her. The drive to the hyper-exclusive Monte Carlo clinic felt like a funeral procession. Zara sat frozen in the back of the armored Bentley, her blood running cold. Beside her, Julian was completely silent. He stared out of the tinted window, his jaw set in a hard, uncompromising line, looking like a man preparing to go to war. His large, warm hand enveloped hers, his grip so tight her knuckles ached. "Julian," Zara whispered, her throat dry, the guilt of her life finally threatening to choke her. "About the baby." He turned to her, and the raw vulnerability in his piercing blue eyes stopped the confession dead in her throat. It was a terrifying mixture of desperate, fragile hope and a dark, consuming danger. "Don't speak," he murmured softly, lifting her hand to press a fervent kiss against her knuckles. "Just let me have this hope for 10 more minutes. Because if we get there, and there is no baby—" He didn't finish the sentence, but the sudden, icy drop in the car's temperature said everything he didn't have to. The clinic was a sweeping marble sanctuary reserved for European royalty and the ultra-rich. When the heavy glass doors opened, Zara felt her stomach plummet. Sitting in the pristine waiting area, looking like the absolute gatekeeper of hell, was Eleanor Vance. Eleanor stood up as they entered. She wore a perfectly tailored suit and a triumphant smile. The smile of a woman who had already written her victory speech. "Dr. Laurent is ready," Eleanor said, her British accent dripping with venomous sweetness. She gestured to a sharp-suited man standing beside her. "And I have brought the family's legal counsel, just in case we need to draft a fraud settlement immediately." Julian didn't even acknowledge the lawyer. His arm wrapped heavily around Zara's waist, physically holding her up as her knees threatened to buckle. "Let's get this over with," he growled, the vibration of his chest rumbling against her side. In the examination room, Dr. Laurent looked pale and sweating. He directed Zara to the leather-padded examination table. As she lay back, staring up at the blinding white ceiling lights, she began counting the seconds until her life officially ended. She braced herself for Julian's explosive rage, for the lawyers, for the inevitable police escort. "This is it," she thought. "I'm going to prison." The freezing ultrasound gel hit her bare stomach, causing her to flinch. Julian immediately stepped closer, taking her hand in a possessive, painful grip. Eleanor stood at the foot of the table, her arms crossed, her eyes glued to the monitor, positively starving for Zara's humiliation. Dr. Laurent pressed the wand to her skin. The room descended into a deafening silence, save for the low hum of the air conditioning and the frantic, roaring pulse in Zara's ears. "Well," Eleanor demanded sharply, "where is the heir?" Dr. Laurent frowned, moving the wand lower and pressing harder. Zara squeezed her eyes shut, a single tear slipping down her cheek. "I'm so sorry, Julian," she thought frantically. And then, a sound pierced the silence. Whoosh, 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 whoosh. It was fast, rhythmic, and incredibly faint, like the sound of a tiny, galloping horse. Zara's eyes flew open in absolute shock. Beside her, Julian let out a ragged, breathless gasp that sounded like pure, unadulterated wreck. "Is that?" Julian whispered, his voice cracking. "That is the heartbeat," Dr. Laurent said, his own voice laced with genuine shock. He pointed to a tiny, flickering gray blur on the high-definition monitor. "She is approximately 6 weeks along." The room spun violently. 6 weeks. Zara's mind scrambled, doing the maths. 6 weeks ago, she was in Miami. 6 weeks ago was the neon-drenched rum bar. 6 weeks ago was the reckless, steamy, unforgettable night in Julian's hotel room. "Oh my God," Zara realized, the blood draining from her face. "I wasn't lying." Eleanor made a choked sound, staggering backward as if she had been physically struck in the chest, her manicured hands clutching her pearls. "Impossible," she hissed. "She's faked it." "Mother," Julian said. His voice was completely unrecognizable. He wasn't looking at Eleanor. He was staring at the screen, tears freely streaming down his cheeks. "Get out." "But Julian." "Get out," he roared, his voice shaking the medical instruments on the tray. "Everyone out. Leave us." The terrified lawyer practically dragged a stunned Eleanor out of the room, and Dr. Laurent quickly slipped out behind them. They were alone. The only sound left in the room was the rapid, rhythmic beating of a new life. Julian collapsed against the side of the table, burying his face in the crook of Zara's neck. His broad shoulders were violently shaking. The ruthless billionaire, the man who bought entire shipping fleets and destroyed his enemies without a second thought, was openly weeping over a gray blur on a screen. You didn't lie, he choked out, his hot tears searing against her collarbone. You carry my life inside you. He pulled back, capturing her face in his large hands. The cold, calculating monster was entirely gone, replaced by a terrifying, obsessive worship. He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, and finally captured her lips in a deep, desperate kiss that tasted of salt and absolute devotion. I will give you the world, he breathed heavily against her mouth, his eyes burning with a dark fire. I will burn down anything that threatens you. You are never leaving me, Zara. Never. A violent shiver ran down her spine. The realization hit her like a physical blow. When she was lying, she had a secret exit strategy. She could have eventually confessed, run, and dealt with the fallout. But now, with a real baby binding her to a fiercely possessive billionaire, she was permanently trapped in a gilded cage. The ride back to the cliffside compound was a completely different experience. Julian didn't just hold her hand. He pulled her directly onto his lap in the back of the Bentley, burying his face in her thick curls while his large hand rested protectively over her stomach. I'm doubling the security, he murmured against her skin, his lips brushing her neck and sending unwanted, heated shivers through her body. No one enters the compound without my permission, especially not my mother. Julian, I can't be a prisoner, she whispered, fighting the intoxicating warmth of his embrace. You're not a prisoner, he corrected softly, kissing her jawline. You are a queen, and the queen stays in the castle, where the dragon can protect her. He reached into his jacket, pulled out his phone, and tapped the screen a few times. What are you doing? She asked, her heart racing. Transferring 10 million euros into your personal account and moving 3 of my Mediterranean cargo ships into your name, he said casually, not taking his eyes off her. Consider it a prenatal gift. 10 million euros. In one click. Zara stared at him, horrified and mesmerized by the sheer scale of his obsession. He looked deeply satisfied, like a predator who had finally dragged his most prized possession into his den. But the sanctuary of their golden cage was about to be breached. As the Bentley pulled through the massive iron gates of the Monaco estate, Julian's head of security was waiting on the driveway, looking grim. He approached Julian's window the moment the car stopped. Sir, the guard said, his voice tense. We have a situation at the outer perimeter. A man from Miami just showed up demanding to speak with Miss King. Zara's blood turned to ice. He says his name is Marcus, the guard continued. And he says he has a secret about her father's debt that you are going to want to hear. The name hung in the chilled air of the Bentley like a live grenade. Marcus. Zara felt the blood completely drain from her face. Her hands, which had been resting on her stomach, began to tremble uncontrollably. Marcus wasn't just her ex-boyfriend. He was the toxic, manipulative shadow she had spent the last 2 years trying to scrape off her shoes. He had no business being in Monaco. He had no business knowing where she was. Who is Marcus? Julian asked. His voice wasn't a yell. It was a terrifyingly soft, deadly whisper. The warm, devoted lover who had just been weeping in the clinic vanished, instantly replaced by the ruthless billionaire predator. He's from Miami, Zara stammered, shrinking back against the leather seat. We dated. A long time ago. Julian, please, you can't let him in. He's dangerous. Julian's eyes darkened, turning to midnight blue. He looked at the head of security through the open window. Bring him to the outer courtyard. Do not let him step foot inside the main gates. And ensure he is unarmed. Julian, no. Zara gasped, grabbing his arm. Just send him away. If you talk to him, he'll twist everything. He always does. Julian turned to her, his large hands immediately coming up to cup her face. His thumbs smoothed over her trembling cheeks. Look at me, Zara, he commanded gently, though his eyes burned with a dark, violent fire. You are a queen, and the queen stays in the castle, where the dragon can protect her. No one from your past is going to touch you ever again. I am going to find out exactly what secret this man thinks he has, and then I am going to erase him from your world. He stepped out of the Bentley, his towering frame completely blocking the blinding Mediterranean sun, and ordered the driver to take Zara up to the main house. But Zara couldn't hide in the house. As soon as the car parked, she scrambled out and ran to the edge of the terraced gardens, looking down at the outer courtyard. Marcus was standing there, looking remarkably small surrounded by Julian's armed security detail. He was wearing a loud, cheap silk shirt, flashing a greasy smile as Julian slowly descended the stone steps to meet him. Mr. Vance, Marcus called out, holding his hands up in mock surrender. Man, this is quite the setup you got here. Hard to get an audience with the king. Julian stopped a few feet away, his posture radiating a lethal, cold authority. He didn't speak. He just stared at Marcus like he was observing a stain on the pavement. Marcus cleared his throat, his smile faltering slightly under the crushing weight of Julian's silence. Look, I'll cut to the chase. I know about the 3 million. I know you bought Elias King's debt, and I know you flew Zara out here to play house. You have 10 seconds to get to the point before I have my men throw you off this cliff, Julian stated flatly. The point is, Elias didn't rack up that debt on his own, Marcus sneered, his true, ugly colors finally showing. I used his boatyard as collateral for my own dealings with the Vargas syndicate. I forged his signature. Zara's old man died thinking he was clean. Up on the terrace, Zara let out a choked gasp, clapping a hand over her mouth. He forged it. The debt was never her father's. And I know you just dropped 10 million euros into Zara's account this morning, Marcus continued, his eyes gleaming with greed. Word travels fast in the banking world. So here is my secret, Vance. Unless you wire 5 million into my offshore account right now, I'm going to tell the press, your board of directors, and your lovely mother that Zara was in on the scam from the beginning. I'll tell everyone she planned the debt to trap a billionaire, and you fell for it like a fool. Silence descended over the courtyard. Zara squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the fallout. She waited for Julian to look up at her with disgust. She waited for the golden cage to finally snap shut and crush her. Instead, Julian threw his head back and laughed. It was a dark, chilling sound that made even Marcus take a step backward. You flew across the Atlantic, Julian murmured, walking slowly toward Marcus. To threaten me? To blackmail my fiancée. It's not blackmail, it's business. Before Marcus could finish his sentence, Julian moved with a sudden, violent speed. He grabbed Marcus by the throat, slamming him backward against the heavy iron gates. The security detail didn't even flinch. Let me explain how business works in my world, Marcus, Julian hissed, his face inches from the terrified man. Zara's debt has already been erased. Her father's name is cleared. And as of an hour ago, she is carrying my heir, which means she is the most untouchable woman on this planet. Julian's grip tightened, his eyes practically glowing with a cold, merciless rage. If you ever speak her name again, if you ever look in the direction of this continent again, I will not just kill you, Julian promised, his voice dropping to a demonic whisper. I will dismantle every piece of your miserable life. I will freeze your assets. I will buy the Vargas syndicate outright just to have them hunt you down for sport. I will burn your world to the ground. Do you understand me? Marcus, turning purple, scrambled to nod frantically. Julian let him drop to the gravel like a sack of garbage. He pulled a pristine handkerchief from his pocket, wiped his hands, and tossed it onto Marcus's chest. Take him to the airport. Put him on a cargo plane to nowhere. If he returns, shoot him. Julian turned his back on the gasping, terrified man and walked back up the stone steps. When he reached the terrace, he saw Zara standing there, tears streaming down her face. She had heard everything. Her father was innocent, and Julian had chosen to violently protect her, completely ignoring the toxic lies Marcus tried to spin. Julian's hardened exterior melted the second he saw her crying. He closed the distance between them, pulling her flush against his solid chest, his large hands sinking into her hair. He's gone, Julian whispered fiercely against her lips. The dead is a ghost. It's just you, me, and our child now. Zara looked up into his deep blue eyes. She saw the danger there, the unyielding obsession, the terrifying lengths he would go to in order to keep her. She had been forced into this world by an impossible ultimatum. She had been locked in, threatened, and cornered. But as his lips crashed down on hers in a scorching, desperate kiss, Zara realized she no longer wanted to find the key. The mechanic from Miami wrapped her arms around the neck of the monster who had saved her, entirely surrendering to the heat of his possessive love. She was trapped in the golden cage, and for the first time, she realized she was the one holding all the power. For 3 weeks, the cliffside compound in Monaco had been entirely sealed off from the rest of the world. Julian had kept his terrifying promise to double the security. The estate was heavily patrolled by men in black suits, the massive iron gates permanently locked, and the airspace above the compound restricted. Inside, the world was reduced to imported marble floors, sweeping views of the sparkling Mediterranean, and the suffocating, inescapable heat of Julian Vance's absolute obsession. Zara woke up precisely the same way she had for the last 21 days, wrapped completely in Julian's heavy, muscular arms, pinned flush against his chest. Even in his sleep, his grip on her was fiercely possessive. His face was buried in the thick, dark curls of her hair, his steady breathing a warm rush of air against her neck. His large hand, calloused from years of gripping the helms of his own racing yachts, rested protectively over the slight, barely there swell of her stomach. She lay perfectly still, tracing the line of his jaw with her eyes. He was devastatingly handsome, a man carved from granite and power, who smelled intoxicatingly of cedar, rain, and cold, hard danger. Zara shifted slightly, trying to free her leg from the tangled silk sheets. Instantly, Julian's eyes snapped open. There was no grogginess, no transition between sleep and waking. He simply went from dormant to entirely lethal in a fraction of a second. His midnight blue eyes locked onto hers, immediately scanning her face for any sign of distress. "Where are you going?" he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that sent a heavy, unwanted shiver down her spine. "Just to the balcony," Zara whispered, her breath hitching as his thumb began to stroke slow, burning circles into her bare hip. "I want to feel the sea breeze. I feel like I haven't breathed real air in weeks." Julian's brow furrowed, a dark shadow crossing his face. The possessive dragon did not like his treasure moving out of his immediate grasp. "The air conditioning is set to your exact preferred temperature. If you are uncomfortable, I will have the staff adjust it." "Julian, it's not the temperature," she sighed, finally managing to push herself up into a sitting position, though his hand remained firmly planted on her waist. She looked down at him, her heart aching with a confusing mix of deep, consuming love and a frantic, clawing need for freedom. "It's the walls. You've locked me in a beautiful 10 million euro box. I'm pregnant, not broken. I need to move." He sat up, the sheet falling away to reveal his broad, scarred chest. He closed the distance between them, framing her face with his large hands, his thumbs brushing over her cheekbones. The look in his eyes was the same terrifying, unhinged worship she had seen in the ultrasound clinic. "You are carrying my life inside you," Julian whispered, echoing the words that had permanently sealed her fate. "My mother is out there somewhere plotting her revenge. You think I will just let you wander out into a world that wants to tear you apart? I told you, I will burn down anything that threatens you. That includes keeping you exactly where I can see you." He leaned in, capturing her lips in a deep, bruising kiss that tasted of mint and absolute ownership. Zara gasped, her hands instinctively coming up to grip his broad shoulders. She wanted to fight him, wanted to demand her independence, but the moment his mouth moved expertly against hers, her resistance melted into pure, heated surrender. He kissed like a sinner, drawing a desperate moan from her throat. He pushed her gently back against the pillows, his heavy body covering hers, the dangerous world outside entirely forgotten in the scorching heat of their intimacy. But the real world, as Zara was quickly learning, did not care about locked doors. A sharp, urgent knock echoed through the master suite, shattering the heavy silence. Julian froze, tearing his mouth away from hers. A lethal rage instantly flared in his eyes. "I gave strict orders not to be disturbed," he snarled at the heavy oak doors. "Sir, it's urgent," came the muffled, tense voice of Elias, the head of security. "It's a code red from the London office. And it's about Miss King." The blood drained from Zara's face. Julian swore violently under his breath, rolling off the bed and pulling on a dark robe. He stalked to the door, unlocking it and throwing it open. Elias stood in the hallway, holding a sleek silver tablet. He didn't look at Zara, keeping his eyes respectfully fixed on his employer. "I apologize, Mr. Vance, but the European markets opened 20 minutes ago, and Vanguard Global stock has plummeted by 12%. It's a coordinated media attack." Julian snatched the tablet. "From who?" "Your mother, sir," Elias said quietly. Zara scrambled out of bed, pulling a silk wrapper tightly around herself, and walked over to Julian. She looked over his massive shoulder at the glowing screen. The headline on the Financial Times website screamed in bold, black letters. "Vanguard Global CEO blackmailed? Billionaire Julian Vance pays off $3 million syndicate debt for American mechanic." Below it was a grainy, zoomed-in paparazzi photo of Zara standing in the Miami boatyard, covered in grease, completely contrasting with the sleek, untouchable image of the Vance empire. "She leaked the debt," Zara whispered, her hands shaking. "She couldn't prove the pregnancy was fake, so she went after the money." Julian's grip on the tablet tightened until the glass screen audibly cracked under his fingers. "There's more, sir," Elias continued grimly. Eleanor Vance has called an emergency meeting of the board of directors for tonight. She is formally questioning your mental stability and your fitness to run the company. She claims you have been compromised by a foreign grifter who extorted you, and that you are currently holding her captive in Monaco to hide the scandal. She is trying to orchestrate a hostile takeover of my own company, Julian growled, his voice dropping into a demonic, terrifying register. The air in the room turned instantly freezing. Prepare the jet. I am flying to London. I will rip her off the board myself. No, Zara said, her voice cutting sharply through the tension. Julian and Elias both looked at her in shock. Julian's eyes narrowed. Zara, this is corporate warfare. My mother is a viper. I am going to London to sever her head, and you are going to stay here behind reinforced steel. If you leave me here and go to London alone, you prove her right, Zara argued, stepping fully in front of him, forcing the towering billionaire to look down at her. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, but the fiery defiance that had kept her alive in Miami was roaring back to life. She is telling the board that you're unstable and that I'm a captive extortionist. If you lock me away and go screaming into a boardroom, you look exactly like the unhinged monster she says you are. Julian's jaw clenched tightly. And what do you suggest? I let her steal the empire I built. No, Zara said, lifting her chin. I suggest we go to the annual Monte Carlo Vanguard Gala tonight. Julian stared at her as if she had lost her mind. The gala is a media circus. Every aristocratic shark in Europe will be there, including my mother. It is a firing squad. Exactly, Zara fired back, stepping closer, refusing to back down from the dark intensity radiating off him. She expects you to hide. She expects me to cower in the shadows because I'm just a desperate girl from New Orleans, or Miami in my case. But if we walk into that ballroom together, hand in hand, looking completely untouchable, we control the narrative. We show the world that I am not a captive, and that you are not compromised. She placed her hand flat against his chest, right over his racing heart. You told me I am the queen, Julian, and the queen stays in the castle. But sometimes, the queen has to show her face so the kingdom remembers who rules it. A profound, breathless silence fell over the room. Elias, recognizing the intensely private shift in the power dynamic, quietly stepped backward out of the doorway and clicked the heavy doors shut. Julian looked down at Zara, his dark blue eyes wide with a mixture of shock, awe, and a rapidly burning, dangerous lust. The ruthless predator had expected a fragile girl he needed to lock away. Instead, he was staring at a woman willing to walk directly into the lion's den with him. You would do that? He whispered, his voice thick with emotion. You would step into the crosshairs for me? You wiped my debt. You protected me from Marcus, she said softly, her eyes locked on his. You said we are a family now. Families fight together. Julian let out a ragged breath, completely undone by her. He dropped the cracked tablet onto the floor, wrapping his arms around her and pulling her tightly against him. If anyone so much as looks at you the wrong way tonight, he promised against her hair, I will have them ruined by morning. I know, she smiled against his chest. Now, if we are going to war, I am going to need a dress. 10 hours later, the Monte Carlo casino was bathed in the blinding light of 100 paparazzi flashbulbs. The Vanguard Global Gala was the crown jewel of the European social season, a place where billion-dollar deals were made over crystal flutes of champagne and reputations were destroyed with a single whispered rumor. Tonight, the air was electric with scandal. Everyone was waiting for the disgraced CEO and his American captive. A sleek, armored black Maybach pulled up to the red carpet. A hush immediately fell over the crowd. The door opened, and Julian Vance stepped out. He looked like an absolute god of war, dressed in a flawless, bespoke black tuxedo that highlighted his granite-carved frame. The cameras erupted, but Julian didn't look at them. He turned, offering his hand into the dark interior of the car. Zara placed her hand in his, and as she stepped out onto the red carpet, the entire courtyard went dead silent. She was a vision of absolute, devastating power. She wore a custom, floor-length gown made of liquid gold silk that clung perfectly to her curves, subtly hinting at the new life growing inside her without apologizing for it. Her deep, beautiful skin glowed against the gold, and her dark curls were pinned back, exposing the breathtaking piece of jewelry Julian had clasped around her neck just an hour before, a heavy, priceless diamond choker. A gilded collar for the golden cage, she had thought when he put it on her, but looking at the stunned faces of the European elite, she realized it wasn't a collar. It was armor. Julian's hand slid from hers to wrap possessively around her waist, pulling her flush against his side. The message was unmistakable, broadcast to every camera and reporter. She is mine, she is untouchable, and we are not hiding. They walked up the steps and entered the grand ballroom. The sea of aristocratic, wealthy guests parted for them like the Red Sea. Whispers hissed through the room, but no one dared meet Julian's lethal gaze. At the far end of the ballroom, holding court near an ice sculpture, was Julian Vance. She was dressed in an imposing silver gown, dripping in her signature pearls. She had been laughing with two Vanguard board members, but the moment she saw Julian and Zara enter, the blood completely drained from her face. Her champagne flute trembled in her hand. "Showtime," Zara whispered to Julian, keeping a flawless, untouchable smile on her face. "Lead the way, my queen," he murmured, his hand a heavy, grounding weight on her spine. They walked directly across the length of the ballroom, every eye in the venue glued to their flawless, intimidating approach. When they finally stopped in front of Eleanor, the tension was so thick it could have shattered glass. "Julian," Eleanor said, her voice tight, desperately trying to maintain her aristocratic mask in front of the board members. "You're here. I thought you would be in London, dealing with the fallout of the morning papers." "There is no fallout, mother," Julian said, his voice a smooth, terrifying purr that sent shivers through the eavesdropping crowd. "Only a minor annoyance. I came to enjoy the gala with my fiancé." Eleanor's eyes darted to Zara, burning with pure, unadulterated venom. "Fiancé. How quaint. It's amazing what a girl from a Miami boatyard can accomplish with a little bit of extortion." The two board members shifted uncomfortably, sensing the impending explosion. Zara didn't flinch. She didn't look away, and she didn't wait for Julian to defend her. She stepped slightly forward, closing the distance between herself and the icy matriarch. "It's a beautiful evening, Eleanor," Zara said, her voice carrying a calm, lethal authority that mirrored Julian's perfectly. "And I understand you've been deeply concerned about Julian's finances. Specifically, a $3 million portfolio acquisition in Florida." Eleanor sneered. "The whole world is concerned, darling. You bankrupt a company to save a mechanic. People tend to ask questions about your sanity." "It wasn't a bailout, Eleanor. It was an investment," Zara replied smoothly, her dark eyes locking onto the older woman's with devastating focus. "An investment that has already yielded a return. You see, while you were busy planting fake stories in the Financial Times, Julian and I were finalizing the transfer of 3 Mediterranean cargo ships into my name." Eleanor choked on her breath. The board members exchanged alarmed glances. "I am now a majority shareholder in the Vanguard European fleet," Zara continued, her voice echoing clearly in the sudden quiet of their circle. "Which means, Eleanor, if you attempt to call a board meeting to question my fiancé's leadership again, I will personally use my voting shares to have you permanently removed from the advisory council and banned from every corporate property Vanguard owns." Eleanor stared at her, completely horrified. The desperate girl she had tried to crush was standing in front of her, dripping in gold, wielding Julian's billions like a loaded weapon. You wouldn't dare," Eleanor hissed, her mask completely fracturing. "Try me," Zara whispered, a dangerous, beautiful smile curving her lips. "I grew up negotiating with sharks in Miami. You are just a guppy in a designer dress." Eleanor's mouth opened and closed silently. Defeated, humiliated, and utterly outplayed in front of her own peers, the matriarch turned on her heel and practically fled toward the exit, the two board members hastily following to distance themselves from her sinking ship. Zara stood there, her heart pounding a triumphant, massive rhythm in her chest. She felt Julian's arms wrap completely around her from behind. He buried his face in her neck, right below the diamond choker, completely indifferent to the hundreds of people staring at them. His chest was shaking with dark, rumbling laughter. "Remind me to never, ever cross you," he groaned against her skin, the worship in his voice absolute and all-consuming. Zara leaned back against the hard, solid wall of his chest, resting her hands over his where they rested on her stomach. The $3 million debt was gone. The hostile mother was vanquished. She was entirely trapped in Monaco, bound forever to a billionaire who would literally burn the world down to keep her safe. But as she looked out over the ballroom of terrified elites, Zara finally accepted the truth of the golden cage. She wasn't a prisoner. She was the one holding the keys. 8 months later, the Mediterranean sun was warm, casting a golden glow over the massive aft deck of the Vanguard Queen, Julian Vance's newest 300-foot mega yacht. Zara sat comfortably on a plush, cream-colored lounger, the sea breeze gently tossing her dark curls. Resting on her lap was a state-of-the-art tablet displaying the latest financial quarter earnings for the Vanguard European fleet, the very fleet she now owned a majority share in. But her attention wasn't on the numbers. It was entirely focused on the heavy, rhythmic kicking against her ribs. She rested her hand on her swollen stomach, a soft, involuntary smile touching her lips. She was almost 9 months pregnant, radiating a quiet, absolute power that had become her signature in the European business world. The heavy glass doors of the yacht's interior slid open, and the temperature on the deck seemed to instantly rise. Julian stepped out into the sunlight. He had just finished a video conference with the Asian markets, dressed in a crisp black dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up, exposing the corded muscle of his forearms. To the rest of the world, he was still the ruthless, cold-blooded billionaire predator who decimated his rivals without a second thought. But the moment his deep blue eyes landed on Zara, the lethal CEO completely vanished. He crossed the deck with his long, predatory stride, completely ignoring his ringing phone, and dropped to his knees right beside her lounger. "You're working," Julian murmured, his voice a low, gravelly purr as he leaned in to press a lingering, searing kiss against her bare shoulder. "Dr. Laurent specifically said you should be resting. Dr. Laurent is terrified of you and says whatever he thinks will keep you from throwing him overboard." Zara laughed, running her fingers through his thick, dark blonde hair. "Besides, I'm just reviewing the acquisition papers for the Miami boatyard." Julian looked up at her, his eyes burning with that familiar, dark worship. After the gala in Monte Carlo, they had completely solidified their power. Eleanor Vance had been quietly forced into an early permanent retirement in the Swiss Alps, completely cut off from the Vanguard board. Marcus was a ghost, never to be seen or heard from again. And true to his word, Julian had used his endless resources to buy out the Vargas syndicate entirely, dismantling it from the inside out and turning Zara's father's old boatyard into a legitimate, multi-million-dollar maritime engineering facility. "The boatyard is yours to do with as you please, my queen," Julian said, shifting his large hands to rest reverently over her pregnant belly. Immediately, the baby kicked hard against his palm. Julian let out a breathless, awestruck sigh, turning his face to press a tender kiss directly against the spot. Even after 8 months, the sheer scale of his devotion still sent a shiver down Zara's spine. He was fiercely, terrifyingly protective of her, but the suffocating control he had wielded in the beginning had transformed into a deep, consuming partnership. He didn't lock doors anymore. He simply stood beside her, daring the world to try and cross them. "I still can't believe we pulled it off," Zara whispered, setting the tablet aside and leaning down to cup his perfectly sculpted jaw. "Sometimes I look around at all of this, the yachts, the compound, the empire, and I remember how it started. An impossible debt and a locked study." Julian's eyes darkened, the memory of his own desperate ruthlessness flashing in the midnight blue. He stood up, sliding onto the lounger beside her. He carefully pulled her into his lap, wrapping his massive arms around her and resting his chin on her shoulder. "I was a monster to you," he murmured softly against her neck, the heat of his breath sending a jolt of pure desire straight to her core. "I cornered you. I forced you into my world because the thought of you walking out of that Miami hotel room and disappearing from my life was something I simply couldn't survive." "You were a monster," Zara agreed with a teasing, wicked smile, turning her head to capture his lips. "But you were my monster." Julian groaned, his hand sliding up to tangle in her curls as he kissed her back. The kiss was slow, deep, and intoxicatingly steamy, filled with all the passion of their reckless first night and the profound love they had forged in the fire since. When he finally pulled back, they were both breathless. Julian rested his forehead against hers. "I promised I would give you the world, Zara. Have I?" "You gave me a golden cage, Julian," she whispered, her dark eyes locking onto his. "But then you gave me the keys, and you let me open the door myself." Julian smiled, a genuine, heartbreakingly handsome expression that was reserved exclusively for her. "And yet you never left." "Why would I?" Zara asked, resting her hand over his racing heart. "I rule the kingdom." As the yacht sailed smoothly over the glittering waters of the Mediterranean, carrying them back toward the impenetrable sanctuary of their cliffside compound, Zara knew her old life was completely gone. She was no longer a struggling mechanic drowning in inherited debt. She was a mother, a billionaire equal, and the fiercely beloved partner of a dragon who had burned the world down just to keep her warm. They were dangerous. They were messy, and they were absolutely perfectly happy. So there you have it, guys. The Miami mechanic didn't just survive the billionaire's golden cage. She took the keys, outplayed his terrifying mother, and made herself the queen of his entire empire. But I have to ask you, is Julian's unhinged, burn the world down for you devotion the ultimate romantic dream? Or is it a massive red flag dressed in a bespoke tuxedo? And what would you have done if you found out the fake pregnancy you used to save your life was actually real? Drop your thoughts and favorite moments in the comments below. Did you love it when she smashed the antique compass, or when she completely shut down Eleanor at the gala? Let me know. Don't forget to smash that like button. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss out on the spice and the drama, and I will see you in the next story.